The iron locomotive sliced through the humid air with its heavy whistle at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as punctual as the recurring ache in a scar. It thundered across the vast, sprawling acreage of the South Creek plantation with a mechanical regularity that Sarah had learned to despise with every ounce of strength remaining in her body after decades of forced labor in the white, endless cotton fields of the Mississippi Delta. And there they were, stationed like sentinels on the same patch of parched red earth, wearing their tattered burlap shifts and planting their bare, calloused feet into the soil like roots that were forbidden from seeking any other horizon. 2 7-year-old girls, identical as 2 halves of a dark secret that no one had ever asked to keep, stretching their thin, sun-darkened arms toward the sky to wave at the Great Northern train as it blurred past in a rush of soot and steam toward the markets of New Orleans. The wealthy passengers peered through the glass of the dining cars with distracted, sentimental smiles, finding a fleeting charm in those children who appeared so innocent, so picturesque in the middle of the blooming cotton. But not a single one of those travelers understood what those frantic waves truly signified in the silence of the plantation. None of them could perceive the raw agony hidden behind the rhythmic motion of those raised limbs, nor the crushing weight of a daily obligation that hung over those girls like a heavy, invisible shackle. Ruth and Naomi waved because the terror of not waving was greater than the exhaustion of doing so. They waved because an even smaller child, their third sister, had been ripped from their mother's desperate arms 7 years prior, traded away like a common piece of livestock, and because the woman who governed the big house had decided that the daily passage of that iron beast was the perfect tool to keep alive a hope she herself had systematically destroyed with surgical, cold-hearted precision. But what no one suspected in that cold December of 1867 was that inside one of those velvet-lined carriages traveled a man who was destined to dismantle the very foundations of South Creek. And the hidden history of those 2 girls was deeper, more jagged and more profoundly painful than any observer on that train could ever have dared to imagine in their most vivid nightmares. Sarah was 32 years old, yet she possessed a heart that had been shattered into so many fragments that she no longer knew how to count the pieces that were left. She had been a fixture of the big house since her own girlhood, cooking over the searing hearth, scrubbing the heavy linens, and serving with a silent efficiency, always waking long before the first light to prepare the coffee that the mistress drank on the wide veranda while the rest of the world remained in slumber. She knew every hidden corner of that grand, imposing mansion with its towering white columns and its ancient moss-draped oaks that stood like ghosts of the past. She knew the high arched windows and the manicured gardens of magnolias that she herself tended every dawn, enjoying the brief coolness that was only a deception before the suffocating heat of the Mississippi summer settled over the valley like a heavy lead lid. She was also intimately familiar with the squalor of the slave quarters, that long, miserable row of cedar-shake cabins on the far edge of the property where weary souls collapsed onto piles of damp straw on the dirt floor, with the stench of mold and human sweat permeating the wooden walls that were too thin to stop the winter wind, let alone the pervasive sadness of the place. Major Thomas Sterling was a man characterized by his thick, graying whiskers and a gaze of absolute authority. He spent his days high upon a bay horse, a silhouette of power overseeing the picking and the ginning, calculating fardels of cotton and barrels of profit, as if those numbers were the only justification for human existence. To the Major, the enslaved people were merely cogs in a vast machine, nameless figures on a ledger of gains and losses. Sarah saw him stride through the kitchen occasionally, but he never once looked at her as though she were a fellow human being. To him, glancing at her was no different than looking at a kitchen chair or a water pail, objects that simply existed to serve a purpose and required neither a name, a soul, nor a history of their own. Mistress Catherine, however, was a different kind of shadow. She looked at Sarah far too much. She watched with icy, translucent eyes that concealed something much darker beneath the surface, a predatory stillness that Sarah had learned to recognize and fear, as one fears a gathering storm that hasn't yet broken, but whose heavy electric scent is already thick in the afternoon air. The mistress spoke with a voice that was practiced and sweet, frequently quoting scripture, about the necessity of submission and the divine duty of servants, smiling with her lips while her eyes remained cold and calculating. It was the specific brand of cruelty that draped itself in the garments of piety and called its own malice a blessing of the Lord. It was on this very plantation, under the unforgiving glare of the southern sun, that Sarah had brought into the world not 2 but 3 daughters during a night of agonizing and protracted labor on the cold floor of her cabin. The old midwife, Mammy Sue, had prayed in low, rhythmic whispers, while the other women of the quarters held Sarah's hands, humming an ancient spiritual that predated the existence of the colonies. They were identical triplets, 3 mirrors reflecting the same delicate face, so tiny that they all nestled together in Sarah's arms, which were already weary from the dual burden of labor and life. Ruth, Naomi, and Esther. 3 lives that had entered the world as a single unit. And Sarah had sworn to her own soul that night that she would keep them together regardless of the cost. That sacred promise survived for exactly 15 days. When Mistress Catherine descended to the quarters that frost-covered morning and stood over the 3 infants wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket, Sarah felt a visceral chill climb her spine like a blade of ice. There was a look in the mistress's eyes that Sarah could not define, but her mother's instinct recognized it as a predator recognizes prey. 3 mouths to sustain, the mistress had remarked with a thin smile that never reached the coldness of her eyes. What an unnecessary drain on our resources. But perhaps I can find a more suitable and profitable destination for one of these little creatures. The words were soft, almost melodic, but the intent behind them was a sharpened knife. 2 weeks later, a meticulously dressed merchant from the high society of Charleston arrived at South Creek. A man in a silk top hat and leather gloves who had recently lost a newborn daughter and whose wife was inconsolable in her grief. Mistress Catherine, in a grotesque display of that hypocritical benevolence the planter class practiced, as if it were true virtue, offered the stranger one of the triplets. A gift of mercy, she called it, intended to fill the void of a dark and mourning house. And so, with the name of the Almighty invoked by lips that knew only the language of ownership, Esther was bundled into a fine lace shawl and handed into the arms of a total stranger. Sarah had screamed until her throat was raw, throwing herself into the dirt at the mistress's feet, begging and promising anything an enslaved woman could possibly offer, which was, in reality, absolutely nothing. The cloying smell of the cotton gin in full motion became etched into Sarah's memory as the scent of that damned afternoon. She did not eat for 3 days, nor did she speak a single word. She remained motionless on her straw mat, staring at the rough-hewn timber ceiling while Ruth and Naomi nursed at her aching breasts, and Mammy Sue sat silently beside her, holding her hand with the patient, weathered strength of a woman who had seen the world break 1,000 hearts and knew that the only defiance left was to continue breathing. "You must survive for the sake of the 2 who remain," the old woman had whispered in a voice raspy from years of tobacco and toil. "If you allow yourself to be consumed by this darkness, the mistress will surely sell the other 2 as well. To live is the only vengeance we can take against such people." It was the weight of those words that forced Sarah to stand on the 4th morning, to wipe the salt from her face, and to return to the big house kitchen with hands that were steady and a heart that was broken, yet stubbornly continued to beat. Before we proceed further into this narrative, I must ask a favor of you who are listening to these echoes of the past. We strive to give breath to the memories and the voices that were never allowed a platform, yet carry the ancient wisdom and the fierce resistance of entire generations. If these accounts touch your soul, subscribe and help us ensure that more people hear these truths, because what is about to unfold will fundamentally shift everything you believe you know about this plantation and the Sterling family. The years crawled by with the agonizing slowness of an open wound that refuses to heal. Ruth and Naomi grew into strong, perceptive girls, possessing the alert eyes of children who realized early on that survival was an active task. They assisted their mother with the lighter chores of the big house and found moments to play among the carvalhos when the overseer was out of sight, creating imaginary kingdoms within the vast white fields that hemmed them in. Sarah fought the urge to think of Esther every hour of every day, but it was a battle she lost. Whenever she looked at the twins, she saw the ghost of the third part of herself. The child who had been spirited away at 2 weeks old and who likely had no inkling that she even had sisters. Sarah lay awake in the profound silence of the night, wondering if Esther was being treated with even a modicum of kindness, if she had a full belly, or if there was anyone who spoke her name with genuine love, or if the name they gave her had been discarded like an old garment, as if changing a name could truly erase the essence of a human soul. It was in the year the girls turned 4 that the railroad arrived, bisecting the South Creek lands, like a jagged scar of iron and coal smoke across the green expanse of the South. The Major took immense pride in the steam engines, having invested heavily in the line to facilitate the transport of his cotton and timber to the bustling ports. Every afternoon at 3, the train would pass with a mournful whistle, carrying the mail and the wealthy elite toward the coast. That whistle became the mechanical heart of the plantation, a signal that the labor of the day was nearing its close, and that only a few hours of service remained before the uneasy quiet of the cabins. And it was in that very moment that Mistress Catherine conceived her most ingenious and sadistic plan. She summoned Sarah to the shaded veranda on a day when the humidity was a physical weight, and said, with that peculiar, unsettling smile, "I've been reflecting, Sarah. Esther must be quite the little lady by now, growing up in Charleston under the care of Mr. Harrison. I've come up with a delightful way for you to maintain a sort of connection with her. From now on, every time the train passes, Ruth and Naomi are to go to the fence and wave to the passengers. Who knows? Perhaps your daughter will be on that train one day. Perhaps Mr. Harrison will travel this way and she will see her sisters waving from the fields. Wouldn't that be a beautiful way to keep a family united, even in their separation?" Sarah understood the malice immediately. This was no gesture of connection. It was a sophisticated form of psychological torture disguised as Christian charity, designed to use a mother's own desperate hope as an instrument of daily torment. The mistress transformed the suggestion into an absolute decree. The girls were required to wave every single day without exception, and if they failed to appear, the punishment was swift and certain, administered by the mistress herself with a switch, while she murmured about the virtues of a grateful spirit. Thus began the ritual that had endured for 3 years by that December of 1867. Ruth and Naomi walking to the tracks, hoisting their thin arms for the benefit of strangers who would never comprehend the tragedy behind those practiced smiles, while Sarah watched from the kitchen window, her hands submerged in scalding water and her eyes burning with tears she was not permitted to shed in the presence of her owners. The only individual in that massive house who seemed to possess even a flicker of human empathy was Julian, the Sterling's youngest son. An 18-year-old student who spent most of the year in Boston, Julian only returned to the plantation during the winter break. He possessed a gentleness in his eyes that his father viewed as a defect, and he had the radical habit of addressing the workers by their names, a practice his older brothers mocked as a sign of weakness. He arrived from the north with trunks filled with books and dangerous ideas about abolition and human rights that sounded like foreign languages in the stifling atmosphere of South Creek. But Julian was absent for most of the year, and Sarah had long ago learned to rely on no one but herself and the 2 daughters she still held. On that particular December afternoon, the train's whistle tore through the air at 3 o'clock sharp. Sarah instinctively dropped her work and moved to the window as she had done 1,000 times before. Ruth and Naomi were in their place, waving as they were told, their small silhouettes stark against the afternoon light. The train roared past as usual, but there was a strange tension in the air that Sarah couldn't identify, a feeling similar to the way the air changes before a great storm, when the birds fall silent and the very earth seems to hold its breath in anticipation of a blow. She had no way of knowing that inside a first-class carriage, his face pressed against the cold glass, sat Julian Sterling, returning home for the holidays. And for the first time in his life, he was truly looking at those 2 girls standing by the fence. He didn't see them as part of the quaint southern landscape. He saw them through the lens of the abolitionist lectures he had been attending in secret, and what he saw filled him with a sudden sharp revulsion. He didn't see joy in the movement of those arms. He saw an agonizing performance of obedience. And the realization of the difference between those two things struck him with a force that made it difficult to breathe. The seeds of a quiet revolution had been sown in the frozen ground of his conscience, and the decision Julian would make in the coming hours would set off a chain of events that would leave South Creek forever changed. Julian disembarked at the local station with the haunting image of those two girls seared into his mind like a branding iron. During the carriage ride from the station to the plantation, he couldn't banish the memory of their eyes that should have been bright with the ignorance of childhood, but instead reflected a weariness that belonged to the aged. He had spent his time in Boston among intellectuals who debated the peculiar institution as a moral abstraction, a problem to be solved with pamphlets and speeches. But now, the abstraction had a face. It had two faces, identical and broken. He spent that first night in his room, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of the mansion he no longer felt was home. He wanted to confront his mother, to demand an explanation for the spectacle he had witnessed from the train window, but a newfound caution held him back. He needed to know the full truth before he acted. The next few days were a study in silent observation. When the train passed again, Julian was hidden behind the heavy drapes of the parlor, watching. He saw the girls appear with the precision of clockwork, their arms rising in that haunting, mechanical wave. He saw the pleasure his mother seemed to take in the sight, and it sickened him. He knew he had to act. 2 days later, pretending he needed to go into town for supplies, he boarded the train himself. But as the locomotive reached the border of the Sterling property, Julian did something unthinkable. He pulled the emergency cord. The train screeched to a violent, jarring halt, sending a cloud of steam and ash over the white cotton fields. Amidst the confusion of the passengers and the rage of the conductor, Julian stepped down into the tall grass with his leather valise. The train eventually groaned back into motion, leaving him alone on the tracks with the two girls, who stood frozen in terror. Ruth and Naomi recognized him instantly. He was the young Master Julian, the one who sometimes brought them sweets or spoke to them kindly. But they were terrified. They had never seen a white man stop a train for no reason. "Please, sir," Ruth whispered, pulling Naomi behind her, her voice trembling. "We have to go back now. Mistress Catherine told us we have to wave and then return to the house immediately. If she sees us talking to you like this, she'll think we've been idle." Julian dropped to his knees in the red dirt, unconcerned with the ruin of his expensive trousers. "Why do you come here every day, Ruth? Why do you wave at the passengers?" Naomi began to cry, the soft, rhythmic sobbing of a child who has been taught to be quiet, even in her grief. Ruth gripped her sister's hand. "Mistress Catherine, she says our sister Esther might be on one of those cars. She was sold away when we were just babes, sir, sent to Charleston. Mama cries for her every single night when she thinks we're asleep. Mistress says that if we wave, maybe she'll see us and know we haven't forgotten her. But we've been waving for years, sir, and she never comes." A cold rage, harder than any iron rail, solidified in Julian's chest. He looked at these two innocent souls and felt a profound shame for his name and his heritage. His own mother had divided a set of triplets. She had turned a mother's broken heart into a daily entertainment, a ritual of false hope designed to keep Sarah in a state of perpetual agonizing debt. "What is your mother's name?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite master. "Sarah, sir. She's the cook in the big house. Please, Master Julian, don't tell the mistress we talked to you. She'll use the switch on us and she'll take it out on Mama too." Julian gave them his word and watched as they vanished into the rows of cotton. He stood alone on the tracks for a long time, the silence of the plantation suddenly feeling like the silence of a tomb. He realized then that his books and his lectures had been a shield. Now that shield was gone, and he was standing in the middle of a battlefield. That evening the dinner at South Creek was a formal affair. Major Sterling spoke at length about the rising demand for southern cotton in the British mills. Mistress Catherine sat at the head of the table, the picture of southern grace, discussing the upcoming Christmas ball and the blessings of their stable, orderly life. Julian sat across from them, unable to eat. He watched Sarah as she moved around the table, a shadow in a white apron. He noticed the way her hands shook as she placed the tureen of soup, the way she avoided every eye, the way her entire existence seemed to be an apology for being alive. After the meal, Once his parents had retired to the parlor, Julian slipped into the kitchen. Sarah was startled, nearly dropping a crystal decanter. She looked at him with wide, fearful eyes, already anticipating a reprimand for some perceived slight. "Master Julian, is there something you need? I can bring it to the parlor for you." Julian didn't answer with a request. Instead, he stepped closer. "I met Ruth and Naomi by the tracks today, Sarah. They told me about Esther. They told me everything." The decanter slipped from her fingers, shattering on the stone floor with a sound like a gunshot. Sarah didn't even look at the glass. She sank to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please, sir, don't. Whatever they said, they're just children. They don't know any better. Don't let the mistress find out. She'll sell them, sir. She's promised me she'll sell them to the Georgia traders if I ever cause trouble." Julian knelt beside her, ignoring the broken glass, and took her calloused hands in his. "I am not here to report you, Sarah. I am here to find Esther. I am here to bring her back to you." The dam finally broke. Sarah wept, her body shaking with the force of 7 years of suppressed grief. She told him the whole story, her voice a low, urgent whisper in the flickering candlelight of the kitchen. She described the night the triplets were born, the short-lived joy of holding all three, and the sheer, unadulterated horror of seeing the Charleston merchant take Esther away in a silk-lined carriage. She described the mistress's idea for the waving, and how it felt like a fresh lash to her heart every single day at 3 o'clock. "I'll go to Charleston tomorrow," Julian promised. "I'll find this Mr. Harrison, and I will do whatever is necessary to bring your daughter home." But the mistress was not easily deceived. She had noted the tension in Julian, the way he looked at Sarah, the way he had been absent during the day. The next morning, before Julian could depart, she summoned Sarah to her sewing room. "You've become quite familiar with my son, haven't you, Sarah?" The mistress didn't look up from her embroidery, but her voice was as sharp as the needle she held. "I've seen the way he looks at you. I've seen him in the kitchen. If I find that you are using Julian to interfere with the arrangements of this house, you will regret it. I will have Ruth and Naomi on a wagon to the New Orleans market by nightfall. Do you understand the weight of my words?" Sarah understood perfectly. She found Julian in the stables and begged him to stop. "Master Julian, please. She knows. She'll sell my girls. I'd rather never see Esther again than lose the 2 I have left. Please, for the love of God, stay out of this." Julian's resolve only hardened. "She won't sell them, Sarah, because I am going to buy Esther, and then I am going to buy you, Ruth and Naomi. I will use my inheritance. I will use every resource I have. I am going to Charleston, and I am going to end this." He left that morning, driven by a righteous fury that his parents had never suspected. If you have stayed with us this far, you know that this is a story of more than just a family. It is a story of the indomitable nature of the human spirit. Stay tuned, subscribe, and share these voices, because what Julian found in Charleston was only the beginning of a journey that would lead him deep into the heart of the Virginia tobacco lands. The journey to Charleston was a long, meditative trek through a landscape he no longer recognized as his own. He arrived in the bustling port city and found the Harrison estate, a place of immense wealth and cold, sterile beauty. But the news he received there was a blow to his heart. Mr. Harrison had sold Esther 2 years prior. His wife had found the girl's presence unsettling as she grew and began to resemble the twins she didn't know she had. Esther had been sold to a tobacco planter named Colonel Vance in the Virginia Highlands. Julian didn't hesitate. He traveled north, through the rugged hills of Virginia, until he reached the Vance plantation. It was a place of harsh labor and little mercy. He found the overseer and demanded to see the young girl from Charleston. When Esther was brought out to the porch, Julian felt as though he were looking at a ghost. She was 7 years old, the perfect image of Ruth and Naomi, but her eyes were void of any light. She looked at him with a flat, hollow stare, the look of someone who had already given up on the world. He knelt before her, just as he had with her sisters. "Esther, do you know who your mother is? Do you know you have sisters named Ruth and Naomi?" The girl's lip trembled, a small crack in the porcelain mask of her face. "I don't have no mother, sir. The lady in Charleston said I was a stray. She said nobody wanted me." "She lied to you, Esther. Your mother is Sarah, and she has spent every day of the last 7 years waiting for you." Your sisters wave at the train every afternoon because they think you might be on it. I've come to take you home." The girl collapsed into his arms, her small body racked with sobs that had been held back for a lifetime. Julian met with Colonel Vance, and after a tense negotiation and a sum of money that represented nearly all of Julian's wealth, the girl was legally his. The trip back to Mississippi was a revelation. Esther sat by the window, her eyes wide with a newfound wonder. Julian talked to her for hours, telling her about the big house, the kitchen, and the sisters who looked exactly like her. When the train finally crossed onto the Sterling property, Julian pointed out the window. "Look, Esther, there they are." Esther pressed her face to the glass and saw them, two girls, her own face reflected back at her, waving with all their might. Esther began to wave back, screaming her sisters' names, though they couldn't hear her. Julian pulled the brake. The reunion on the tracks was a scene of such raw, unshielded emotion that even the train conductor was moved to silence. The three sisters clung to each other in the red dirt, three parts of a whole finally reunited. Julian led them back to the big house, his head held high. Mistress Catherine was on the veranda, her tea cooling in her hand, when she saw the four of them approaching. The porcelain cup shattered on the floor. Major Sterling appeared in the doorway, his face pale as he realized that the past had finally caught up with him. Julian stepped onto the porch, Esther's hand in his. "I have brought her home, Mother, and I have the papers to prove she is mine, and now I am going to free her." But the day held one more secret. Major Sterling, faced with the undeniable evidence of his wife's cruelty and his son's courage, finally broke. He confessed the truth that had been hidden for 30 years. Sarah was his own daughter, the child of a woman he had once loved and then abandoned to the quarters. He had allowed his own flesh and blood to be enslaved, and he had allowed his wife to torture her out of a twisted sense of jealousy. Julian didn't wait for his father's permission. He signed the manumission papers for Esther, and then he forced his father to sign the papers for Sarah, Ruth, and Naomi as well. The South Creek plantation was never the same. Julian eventually took over the management, turning it into a place of fair wages and dignity. Sarah and her three daughters remained, no longer as property but as a family. Years later, on a warm December afternoon, the train passed by the fence. Sarah, Ruth, Naomi, and Esther stood together. They didn't wave because they were afraid. They waved because they were free and they wanted the whole world to know it. If this story has moved you, please subscribe and share. We must never forget the voices of those who suffered, and we must always celebrate the courage of those who fought to set them free. I am Miguel Andrade, and this has been the story of the Sterling sisters. Thank you for being part of this journey.